Welcome. Welcome. I am delighted to welcome you to our talk today with artist Roberto Lugo. We're just going to give it a second for people to filter in. We have a full house, as it were, tonight. And as we get started tonight, I'd like to ask our colleague who will be doing the interpretation from Babia Collective Cristobal to join us and tell us about the interpretation.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Cristobal. I will be one of today's interpreters for today's event. I'm here with my colleague Pau. We have interpreter in our name, and we will be doing simultaneous interpretation for the call today. Mi nombre es Cristóbal. Estoy aquí con mi colega Pau. Soy uno de los intérpretes que vamos a estar ofreciendo interpretación simultánea para el evento de hoy. Tenemos intérprete en nuestro nombre. So I just want to share some brief instructions on how to activate the Zoom interpretation feature. Quiero compartir algunas instrucciones de cómo activar la función de interpretación en Zoom. You will see on the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen an interpretation icon that is like a globe. You can select on that, choose that icon, and you'll see a pop-up menu that allows you to select Spanish, English, or the original audio, which means the interpretation is off. When you select your preferred language channel, you will hear the interpreter's voice interpreting to Spanish or to English, depending on your selection. So, en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla de Zoom pueden ver un botón que dice interpretación con un icono de globo y ahí pueden seleccionar su lenguaje preferido de inglés o español o la opción principal que es el audio original sin la interpretación. Una vez escojan su canal de lenguaje preferido, van a poder escuchar la voz del intérprete interpretando simultáneamente a su lenguaje que escogió. We want to remind speakers to please keep a moderate pace when talking. We are interpreting live, so it really helps us to catch everything you're saying and provide the best interpretation possible. Le pedimos a los ponentes que hablen un poco a un paso moderado. Estamos interpretando simultáneamente y nos ayuda mucho a escuchar bien claro lo que dicen para poder interpretarles bien. If you're bilingual and switching languages, please do so after a brief pause. Si es bilingüe y va a cambiar de lenguaje, por favor hágalo luego de una breve pausa. And also, if you have any issues with interpretation at any moment, you can feel free to message me or Pau. We have an interpreter in our name, and we can help you troubleshoot. Si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, pueden escribirme a mí o a Pau. Tenemos intérprete en nuestro nombre y podemos ayudarte con cualquier problema técnico. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you. So as we begin, I will start with our land acknowledgement. The Philadelphia Museum of Art recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hokink, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the walking purchase of 1737, displaced many Lenape from this land. The museum and its staff strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations, Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors past and present by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. My name is Linnea West. I work in public programs at the museum, and so it is my pleasure and my honor today to introduce our speaker, Roberto Lugo. Roberto, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We're truly thrilled to be able to do this talk with Roberto. He has had work on view at the museum, actually in several instances over in the recent years. And currently, the All About the Benjamin Century Vase is on view. It's in Gallery 388. So I encourage you all, if you haven't seen it in a while, or if you haven't seen it yet, to come into our galleries and make sure that you find it. To share a little bit of background about Roberto, he is a Philadelphia-based artist, ceramicist, social activist, poet, and educator. He puts portraiture and surface design that speaks to his North Philadelphia upbringing and hip-hop culture on classical pottery forms, with the aim of highlighting issues such as poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. In that sense, he is reimagining traditional European and Asian ceramics and adding a contemporary street sensibility so that classical decorative patterns and motifs combined with elements of urban life, graffiti, and portraits of individuals who historically have been absent from luxury vessels like these. Roberto's work has been featured in exhibitions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, and the Museum of Art and Design in New York, among others. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including a 2019 Pew Fellowship, a Cynthia Hazen Polsky and Leon Polsky Rome Prize, and a U.S. Artist Award. Roberto's work is found in the permanent collections of museums across the country, including the Philadelphia Museum, and he is currently an assistant professor at Tyler School of Art and Architecture here in Philly. We're going to put a link in the chat to his website in case you want to find out more about what's going on with Roberto. And of course, we have him here to tell us all about it. So I'm happy to turn this over to you, Roberto, and I'm just so excited to hear your talk tonight.
Thank you. You ever have a pain in your heart that no drug could fix? It leaks down in your stomach, baby. It makes you sick. You could try everything you can, but there ain't no fix to get rid of it. So hear my words and stand tall like a New York Knick. I know you dealing with nitwits, been smoking your cigarettes and chewing your nicorettes and filling your stomach with liquid as strong as liquor gets. But listen up, those who fall are destined to ball, because in spite of it all, you're the first that we call when we're pressed to the wall from dealing with y'all. So don't get mad when this world don't think you're a 10, because in the end, those who've seen this world's ugly are dimes in the end. I learned poetry and I learned art making in the streets of Philadelphia. I'm from Kensington. And growing up here, as many of you know, was quite a struggle. Kensington is known in Philadelphia for its crime, for its prostitution, for its drug use. But I knew it as home for many years. What I didn't know in hindsight is that I didn't have the luxury of having art classes growing up. So in many ways, the streets were the places where I learned how to make art and what art was about. So as a young teenager, I started to paint graffiti with my cousins, and I saw it more as a pastime than I really saw it as an art form. Many years later, when I started to go to art school, I started to see it as an art form. And my experience with art history took place on the streets as well. Looking at the murals in the streets of Philadelphia, it began to my visual vocabulary of what art is, or what I thought it was. And what really struck me was the portraiture of people of color, people that looked like me, and the incredible things that they had done. And that became the prelude to a lot of what it is that I do today. Here's a mural of Tariq Trotter of the Roots, that I painted on the side of the Clay Studio here in Philadelphia on American Street. This particular piece has a Sev porcelain vase on it. And is the time porcelain was considered more expensive than gold. So thinking of Tariq Trotter as this regal MC that is really the forefront of hip hop culture and society today. My work as an educator is incredibly important to me. But because of my roots, I think about education really expansively, not just as a professor, an assistant professor at Tyler School of Art, where it is that I work at, but also I teach in many different situations, such as teaching pottery in the sides of the streets and the communities that I grew up in. I also have taught through the Clay Studio at juvenile detention centers and in elementary schools, as well as dozens of different institutions that I've taken part in as a visiting artist. But what's most important for me thinking about teaching in the side of the street is the fact that, you know, it took so much for me to be able to get the opportunity for me to be an artist today. To tell you a little bit about my story, I left Philadelphia at this age of 25 years old because I saw so many of my cousins and friends were in and out of jail, And I just saw myself going down the same route. So I winded up moving to Florida, where I had some family, and I found a community college that was only $300 a class. And because of my education in Philadelphia, I didn't really want to go something where I'd have to do extensive writing. So because of my experience with graffiti, I decided to take an art class. And one of the first classes that I took was a drawing class with a teacher that was a potter. And he told me to try the pottery wheel. And my life has been changed ever since.
When you give someone like me an opportunity, you know, someone that comes from a family that works so hard, we just really put ourselves into it. When a lot of people come from schools like mine, they pursue trades or jobs just like blue-collar work, which is fine if that's like really what they want, but I think a lot of times they don't really feel like they got another option. And just that vision of somebody that looks like them making pottery, I think is a huge impact. Studios moving here, you know, they're moving to Kensington. They'll see that building and say ceramics and they'll think, oh, that's for other people, you know, to take classes there, but really it's for them. By being here and showing them that people that look like them are doing it, maybe they'll just take a class. Good job.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
Yes.
No, it's good. Yeah, there you go. Love that tattoo, loyalty. It's tight.
Thank you.
I think through the process of teaching, it complicates the narrative of what people from communities like Kensington think that they're capable of, or what's come before them often paves the way for what people think that they can do themselves. And so seeing someone that comes from that community, also being a potter, being an artist, expands in, the options for them. So I think that's really incredibly important. As far as my studio work, I'd like to talk a little bit about where the origination for my idea of putting people of color on pottery comes from. During the critique, my undergraduate studies at the Kansas City Art Institute, my wife had a portrait of me in one of her art classes, and someone referred to me as a Mexican gangster. And although I've been called a lot of racial slurs or things that are insensitive throughout my life, at the time, I was really focusing on making work and being a potter, being a functional potter, and being good at it. And what it made me realize is that in some ways, no matter what I did, I was always going to be seen as a person of color and a spectacle because of the fact that I was in mostly white spaces with people that didn't have any experiences like those of mine. So after that, I went to the library and I began to study and I was confused as to what career I had chosen for myself. And I came across this book of Worcester porcelain, and I was studying ceramics history with a professor named Michelle Fricke, and she was teaching us ceramic art history since the Industrial Revolution. And one of the things that we learned was that porcelain was considered more expensive than gold at the time, where it was being traded from China in the 18th century. And when Germany finally got the recipe for porcelain and Europe and France followed, France and England followed, the objects that they started to make were really reminiscent of the Asian predecessors, but they started to commission works that had portraits of people on the vignettes. And I started to get the idea of, why can't I put myself in a pot? Why can't I put myself in this space where I don't belong? And that started me on the trajectory of the work that I make today. I continue to put portraits of myself on work. The work on the left is an experience that I had at Penn State, walking around with a bandana on my head. And, I tend to sweat when I'm making pottery. And so I have this bandana to catch my sweat so I can't touch my face and get clay all over me. But one of my peers also had a bandana that she would wear. And I always thought of it as something that looked really neat on her. And I never really thought of the relationship between that bandana and gangs until I was walking around in Penn State and someone saw me and walked on the other side of the street. And it made me realize that, somehow this bandana on my face and body was seen as some sort of threat because of what they'd seen on TV with folks like me wearing bandanas. I looked like a Blood or a Crip to them. So I started to make this work referencing that visual language of Bloods and Crips. And at the same time, my brother was incarcerated. And my brother who grew up with me and slept in the same bed, and we ate the same food every day. He winded up in prison and somehow winded up in graduate school. And it really made being there very complicated. I thought about what steps I had made in my life and how I winded up getting the place where I got, and him winded up being where he was. And I had a critique, and I made this piece of work for it. I started sculpting a portrait of myself, and I realized it looked a lot like my brother. So I kept the portrait of my brother, and I made one of myself, and I used our heads as saucers to catch the residue, the drips that happen when people drink tea. And in a critique, I decided to write a poem because I was so afraid of public speaking. And that began this relationship with thinking back about growing up in Kensington. And we would drum on the lunch tables at school and recite hip hop, and we'd write lyrics, and we'd battle rap each other during class and between classes. And I decided to write this poem about my experience with my brother. My brother's locked in a state pen. Me, I make art at Penn State. You see, I'm a potter, I make plates, and him, he's in jail, he make plates. You see, I tried to be a student, and I got home, I opened my cupboards, and all I saw was stew. Then I turned around, I got smacked, and all I did was stew. Then I thought I'd join a synagogue. But when it came to church, I just saw its walls cracked by its cinder blocks, and words went over my head like a cinder shot. Being fat left this world disappointed like a sinner's pop. I thought I could be a veteran. But when it came to war, I just saw my Pearl Jam like that veteran man. Gunshots keep me up late lights like Red Man. I can't be no Christian. I get confused to the thank for these pots that I'm pissing in. But now, not only do I have a pot to piss in, but I can make it myself. That's the thing about art. That's the thing about craft. It allows you to bring things into this world that you didn't see before. It allows you to show people the beauty of what African textiles juxtaposed with Asian ceramics, juxtaposed with European forms, with the faces of the people that paved the way for me to be here. Honoring people like Basquiat with the crown that I put on the top of the piece, the graffiti that my cousins taught me to draw, along the sides, with the portrait of Martin Luther King on one side here, Erykah Badu on the other side. Ceramics history plays a huge role in what it is that I do, because I think quite often about what is absent for ceramics art history, and the fact that my family and culture and my history and the history of my ancestors is often something that's not captured in ceramics, and especially in craft. I look at objects such as the Centennial Vase, the piece on the right-hand side, made it for the 1876 World's Fair by Trenton Porcelain Works. It shows the first 100 years of the United States of America and what we thought were innovations made here. But it also is a form of propaganda showing the trade between indigenous people and our colonizers. And so I decided to use that format, that structure, to be able to make works of my own. The piece on the left is called A Century of Brooklyn, which is on view at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And this piece, all about the Benjamin Century Vase, which is on view at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. One of the things that's really important to me is how my work becomes a place for a conversation to happen. I've heard stories of how often groups of school children will go to the museum, and when they see my work, sometimes it's often the first thing that they recognize and understand. From the hip hop lyrics that are on the piece to the design, the decoration, the graffiti, but also the fact that they become the educators at some point and start teaching their teachers what these pieces mean. The teacher understands that the Century Vase comes from the 1876 World's Fair and the history of porcelain, where the student understands the hip hop lyrics and the folks that I'm featuring on my works. So it becomes this platform for conversation to exist. This is the Scarab Vase on the left-hand side, also known as the 1,000-Hour Vase, made by Adelaide Alsop Robino, which is currently at the Everson Museum in Syracuse. This piece, for me, is one of the highlights of the history of American studio ceramics, and becomes a perfect platform for me to make a work inspired by it. The work on the right-hand side is called the Roach Vase. It didn't quite take 1,000 hours, but it did take me quite a while to carve it. This is the hip hop bowl, was inspired by the jazz bowl made by Victor Schreckengoss, which is on the far right-hand side of the screen. At the time, jazz was considered a controversial music platform, so it's in the same way that hip hop is seen today. So being able to reference this puts the art form, the music form that has inspired me so much in the same context as this jazz bowl was originally. Another piece that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is this piece right here that features Mike Brown on it. And although it's really complicated to put a portrait of someone who's passed away, especially the way that he died from police violence, it reminded me of that experience because I've had so many experiences, like when I was driving down to Georgia to visit my family from college, and I was pulled over, and they were driving by me, and they looked in the inside of my car, and they saw me, and they pulled behind me and pulled me over. And I knew this was going to happen, but they asked me to get behind my car. I put my hands in the police car, and they asked me if they can search my car. And at the time, I was afraid because I had a bunch of ceramics. I was trying to bring pottery home to my family to show them what I had been up to all year. But I said no to the search, and instead they got K9 units to look through, to smell my car. And eventually they opened my car and looked through it. And they found pottery with my portrait on it. And I used that as an example and said, you see, it has my pictures on it. This is my work. This is what it is that I do. But they still didn't believe me. I think about that with situations like Mike Brown, because one day I was painting a portrait of myself. This is something that happens to artists quite often, where you're working at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you wake up and you realize that you've been working, but you don't remember actually working. You were sort of sleepwalking. And I thought, man, I just painted another portrait of myself instead of doing this portrait that I meant to do. But I realized that my portrait of my high school graduation photo looked very similar to Mike Brown's. And it made me realize how quick and how instant that could have been me in that situation. So I put that piece right next to a life-size portrait of myself, because the actual form of this object is made from my own shape, my own body shape, where the neck of the pot meets the neck of my body, the shoulders meet the shoulders, and the feet meet the feet. The belly of the pot meet the belly of me. The piece in the middle is called a DNA study, and it's painted to show all the different percentages of my DNA, my African ancestry, my Spanish, my Portuguese, and my Taino indigenous ancestry. That makes up my Puerto Rican blood and heritage, and why I paint the things that I do, and why I think so much about ancestry and how hard my family had to work to get where I'm at. My father, for those of you familiar with Kensington, used to ride his bike from Kensington and Philadelphia to Cherry Hill, New Jersey, just to start his job every day. And he'd ride his bike often over the Ben Franklin Bridge. So I made this piece with Ben Franklin on one side and my father on the other side. I often think about the patterns that make up cultures and how they represent the traditions. And I think about what patterns make up the culture that I grew up with, how Nikes were made popular in the urban areas, the urban impoverished areas, and how those sneakers influence so much culture in other places. I make these sneakers now to show the relationships between pottery, pattern, and textile. I also want to talk a little bit about my work that's in the Afrofuturistic period room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This particular work is called Diggable Underground, and it features Harriet Tubman on one side and Erykah Badu on the other. And just to show you how fate works, the week that this exhibition was up, I didn't plan this, but Erykah Badu had a dress with Harriet Tubman on it. And I thought to myself, how likely was this to happen? But it did. This particular exhibition talks a little bit about Seneca Village, a village, the first middle-class community of Black folks in New York City, and how their land was taken from them. And that reminds me of how my family's land was taken from them in Puerto Rico. My grandfather couldn't afford to have road built to his home, so he became landlocked and would have to climb a mountain to go up and down into his house every day. And when we recently visited Puerto Rico, we were asking if anybody remembered my grandfather, and they remembered him as the man who carried the icebox on his back up the mountain. Here's an image of my work installed in the Afrofuturistic Period Room, which is a collection of works and objects from artists and visionaries from the African diaspora. My work is in the middle underneath this hearth. I also worked on in a larger scale. This is a work at Grounds for Sculpture in New Jersey. This work is Put Yourself in the Picture. And Put Yourself in the Picture was made and inspired. The title is inspired by a poem by KRS-One that talks a little bit about visualize wealth and put yourself in the picture. But also it's a pun on how I often put portraiture in the middle of my pots and the vignette areas. So people can actually walk into the sculpture and see themselves reflected in the work and take a photograph of themselves. I thought about this because often in a lot of the art shows and craft shows, people will take selfies of themselves with the artwork. And this is often seen in bad taste, but I often think it's a sign that people want to see their work and their families and their own image reflected in the artwork that they're going to go see. This work is now going to be permanently installed at the Grounds for Sculpture in New Jersey. And there's a upcoming Deaf Poetry Slam planned for the inside of the space to activate it. Here are some works made during my time. Music plays a huge role in my work. So as I was listening to the Wu-Tang Clan, I painted a portrait of the Old Dirty Bastard on one piece. And then as I was watching the Phillies play, I painted a portrait of Roberto Clemente on another piece. I also make these works that are inspired by the walls in Philadelphia, these pieces that are hand-built and have this sort of rough structure on the outside, but also these hand-painted portraits that are reminiscent of the portraits I grew up seeing on the walls of Philadelphia. On the left here, you see Mark Anthony. In the middle, you see Miles Davis. And then on the right, you see Charles Barkley. On this particular screen, I'm also working with narrative. So on the left-hand side, you see a bodega with an EBT sign showing that the community there is largely on food stamps. And these are saccharine memories, even though they're difficult for a lot of people. They're also memories of home, so they're sweet to me. Like the image on the right-hand side, which is my mother ironing my sister's hair on an ironing board. I also make work that's available to the general public. And this is important to me because I'm really inspired by the Mengay movement and the arts and craft movement, who are really interested in bringing handmade goods to the general public. So in my work, I often reference where it is that I'm from. These are my kids. Otto is on the left-hand side and Theodore is on the right-hand side. You might be able to hear them in my presentation in the background here. They're awfully loud. But the work that I make often references where I'm from. So the piece in the right-hand side, on the bottom right-hand side, is a septa-train butter dish. And the piece behind that is a coffee pour-over that was a collaboration between myself and an artist, Charlie Cunningham. The piece on the far left, that's a figurative sculpture, is a bookend. And you see a cup, a small jar, and a fire hydrant that operates as a small vase. Here's an installation that I made at Design Miami last year. And Design Miami coincides with Art Basel. And we made this installation, and I was able to give a lecture there with Erica Badu on kintsugi and making mistakes and repair and restoration. And this installation was meant to look like a bodega from the community that I grew up in, but it had objects like cups and butter dishes and wallets and bags and things that I had designed and made myself. So this piece on the, this particular piece is called the School to Prison Pipeline, and it envisions the relationship between the orange and black of Greek pottery and the orange and black of prison uniforms. So in the bottom of this particular work, you can see school children lined up in a cafeteria waiting for food. In the middle, you can see people waiting in line for food stamps. And on the right, you can see people in prison waiting in line for food. It shows the direct relationships between children how we grow up in these communities and how we have very little opportunities and how that lack of opportunity often leads to crime. And there's a direct relationship between all of these things that I'm trying to exhibit through my work. I often tell stories with my work, personal stories. So the piece in the middle here is a story of a white supremacist group in Philadelphia called Whites Taking Over, assaulting a man in the middle of the street, and my brother and cousin stopping to stop the fight, and my brother being knocked unconscious with a bottle of beer, and my cousin riding his car with my brother in it over to my uncle's house, where I have 57 first cousins, and most of the males came over, grabbed weapons, and went over to fight this white supremacist group. And when my brother woke up, he also went over and decided to fight again. The piece on the right-hand side is called, it's about the week that I moved into a new neighborhood, which had a baseball field in the back, and I decided to go play baseball in the field. And I was met with a group of white boys playing, and I decided to go up to them and ask them if I can play baseball. One of them pushed me to the ground, and another put a baseball bat to my face and said, "Spics don't play on the grass, they mow it." Years later, this particular field was vacant. There was no maintenance of it, and it eventually became a place for drug use, and is now a place where there's a school was built on it, but it's no longer a field, showing me at a very early age the idea of white flight. This is the Peacock Room, which is an installation inspired by the Peacock Room, the Asian Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., but is also designed by Whistler, the artist. And in this installation, I have over 63 pots that are individually designed to show my family's journey over from Puerto Rico to Philadelphia, and for me to be where it is that I am now. I'd like to end this presentation, or at least this part of my presentation, with a poem on art and how I think art is very important and why we should keep it in schools. So when you cut the arts, baby, you cut the heart strings off the body that freedom rings. If you cut the arts, the fun war, what are we fighting for? They tell us to paint houses, but not to paint a canvas. You'd rather see me in encampments than exceeding on a campus. Without art, how you gonna dance when you ace that math test? Who's gonna sing your praises when you get that high mark? Without art, we're quick to draw guns, apt to sing war cries and dance around the issues. You wanna stop violence? Pick up some violins. You see, those who draw good are the last to draw blood, and those who throw pots were the last to throw shots. So when you cut the arts, baby, you cut the heart strings off the body that freedom rings. I want to thank everybody so much for spending this time with this first part of my presentation. And I would love to open it up to the community here to ask any questions of me and for me to be able to give them information on my studio practice or just anything that you'd like to know.
Thank you so much, Roberto. That was a really, a wonderful presentation overall, and a great poem to end on. I'd like to ask everybody, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll give you a moment to think about any questions you might have. But if you put them in there, you'll also see there's this helpful feature where if you see a question that you like and you want to hear it answered, you can give it a thumbs up, and that'll send it to the top of the queue in the chat, and we can answer those first. And I see so many great comments coming in through the chat, and thanking you, Roberto. So truly, I just want to echo that and say it was an inspiring presentation, and I see the questions are coming in. Roberto, are you comfortable with me reading them out loud?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'll just start with the first one from Julia Fleischner, who writes, "You're an inspiration to so many in the Philadelphia area. Many artists leave for New York, but it's great to see that you are here. Do you plan on staying in this area to raise your voice?"
Yeah, I love Philly. It's home for me. I'm a big Phillies, Eagles Flyers, Sixers, sports person. But also I find that there's a soul to the city, something that I haven't been able to find anywhere else. And there's a spirit to it that I feel like is part of me. And because this is the community that raised me, I feel like it's so important to be able to give back and start to create opportunities for other people to be able to have access to the arts. So I have a lot of programs and things planned on my own to be able to provide those opportunities to other people. So it's crucial for me and my kids to be able to be here.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Wow, it's great to see so many questions coming in, and keep them coming. Denise Tepe asks, can you describe how ceramics as a medium has helped establish legacy within marginalized communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is there's a great lecture called Clay and Color by Namita Gupta Wiggers, the 93 Why. And she talks a little bit about how ceramics history has largely been talked about in American culture through the lens of Asian and European ceramics, but rarely does South American ceramics, African ceramics, Middle Eastern ceramics get talked about. And so I think it's incredibly important to teach that in schools. The other thing I think that's really important is how a lot of those works of art are actually the beginnings of ceramics and how we know about a lot of cultures in the past. And so as contemporary makers, we're making things that last for thousands of years. And we can see that through anthropology museums and other places that exhibit these works to tell us about what people were doing and what people are still doing. But today, through social media, one of the biggest benefits of social media is we get to see, Mexican craft people, African craft people making ceramics online, and we can connect with them and see their work and be inspired by them, which I think is great. Ceramics, though, American studio ceramics, I could say is a largely white space. And there's a lot of people working today to be able to complicate that narrative and change that. A great institution here in Philadelphia is called Oya Studio, which is founded by Yinka Arafidia, which is a studio, but also going to be an African-American museum for ceramics. And so I think those types of spaces should be really supported, and we should look at ways that we can bring more artists of color to light.
Awesome. We have a question here that's gotten a couple of thumbs up. Camila Rondon asks, is poetry a personal passion or another evolution of your work? And are you considering publishing at some point?
I've gotten that question a lot. And what's interesting is I really feel like my poetry is most effective performed because it comes from spaces where, I don't just sit down and write. Often writing comes from of trying to respond to an experience. So it's often responsive, and that's why it's so personal, and why I think it's effective. Why I think people really respond and connect with it. But I'm really inspired by poetry, and it's the only creative writing that I grew up doing. It was hip hop, but also in school we would write poems. That's one of the things that I would say the Philadelphia Education School District would often do is like have poetry contests and slams. And so I grew up doing that, and it's a deep way of expressing myself, but it's also a form of representation, representing what it is that I feel at the time.
If I could build on that question, I'm curious because I think on your pots you're telling stories, and in your poems you're telling stories. Are there ever poems that turn into pots or vice versa?
Yes, I mean, not necessarily in my own poetry, but like, a lot of times I'll be listening to poetry while I make pottery. And I really feel like those two things riff off of each other. I feel like music is a huge deal for me. I listen to a really wide vocabulary of music, not stuff that would be in everybody's taste, but, things that remind me of my family, like salsa music or, hip hop music, but also, spiritual music, acoustic music. all these different things. I wind up making different kinds of work, but they also garner different memories. So my work is so much about memory, and I'm speaking from my own personal experience, because one of my former professors told me something that really connected with me, which was the more personal story you tell, the more universal it becomes. And I think that is so often true because of the fact that, like, when you tell a story that's so personal, people wind up connecting it to one of their own experiences. And then they really respond to the work even further because they know it comes from a deep place.
Awesome. Thank you. A quick comment or answer to Isaiah Alston, who asked, will we have access to this webinar recording? Yes, we are recording, and we're going to send a follow-up email to everybody who registered that has a link to the recording. So Kaylee Asbury asks, are there artists in your friends group who inspire your work and or who you think are doing really exciting things in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the really interesting things about that is it doesn't look like the way you think it would. The people that I think I connect with is human beings. Don't necessarily make narrative work, aren't always other people of color, aren't always people that do poetry or are into hip hop. So one of my best friends is Margaret Kincaid, and we went to graduate school together. And she's from Oklahoma, and she makes these beautiful handmade pots that are inspired by quilts. But our work transports me to these different spaces, whereas a lot of times I suffer from anxiety and depression. Her work really presents me with a moment of peace and tranquility and thinking about the craft and labor that goes into artwork, but also to be in this rural space that I always imagine myself being in, that my ancestors grew up in farms in Puerto Rico. Both my parents grew up in farms in Puerto Rico, and I've always dreamed of myself being in that type of space. And so looking at her work reminds me that, it makes me feel that. But then there's artists like Malcolm Mobutu Smith, who is a potter from Bloomington, Indiana, or teaches there at least. And he really inspires me because he's the first person I've seen merge graffiti and ceramics together, and that became an early influence in my career. In terms of historic artists, I'm really inspired by some obvious people like Jean-Michel Basquiat, but I'm also really into artwork like Cy Twombly and abstract expressionism. But I also love just going into the museum and seeing some of these historical spaces and looking at objects and just thinking to myself, this thing has been around for 2,000 years and I get to physically exist in the same space as this object. And I really respond to that. Like recently I got to visit the Princeton Art Museum's Greek pottery collection, and they opened it up and I got to see the insides of Greek pots and the bottom of Greek pots. And I just thought about the history of that and how I can see the throwing lines of somebody who made something 2,000 years ago in the same way that I made something. And it made me feel like I was part of this heritage of artists.
It sounds like an amazing experience, and thank you. That's very cool. We have so many compliments coming into the chat, into the Q&A. And so Virginia Robinson, just to read one out loud, no question yet, but a compliment. When you introduced Roberto, you didn't mention that he had a fantastic exhibit in the Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the 4th most visited museum in the country. It was tremendous.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Could you tell us what work you had in the Renwick?
Yeah, I had a particular piece that I had a few pieces in there, but I had a piece with it was, a very common piece that I make, which is one piece where it has Biggie Smalls on one side and Tupac Shakur on the other side, two people that were really famous during their time, but even more famous after they passed away, and they were hip hop artists, but also two people who died from gun violence. And to imagine their portraits existing in a space that's historically exhibited craft, and thinking about ceramics as being this medium that lasts for thousands of years, for me is really powerful, because it means that their legacies are going to exist far after, I'm gone and everybody who's in this chat is gone. And for me, that's really important, because these stories need to go on, because I feel like these experiences lend to like learning, and we don't learn anything about ourselves as people unless we document our history, and we can see that some things just happen over and over and over again.
It's such a great coincidence that you mentioned melting pot. So we have a comment question here from Carrie Mongaluzzo, who says, hello from the Palmer at Penn State. Our students are so taken when they engage with melting pot with Tupac and Frida Kahlo on opposite sides. Some of our student workers are curious about the connections between the two. If Frida and Tupac had a conversation, what do you think they would have discussed?
You know, that's really great to hear, because when I was a student at Penn State, I was really impacted by the work of Yinka Shonibari, which is exhibited at the museum. And that really changed so much for me as an artist, being able to see somebody who was bridging their African ancestry with their, you know, English upbringing, and how they brought both of those things together in a really powerful way, made me think about how I melt these cultures together. So thinking about, you know, Tupac and Frida, I both think that they're really creative. What's the right word for this? Charismatic people. And I think that they were both artists of their generation. Tupac being a hip hop artist, but also really a poet, and in many ways seen as an activist and a complicated figure, just as Frida Kahlo is. Tupac being a complicated figure, and as you know, he was also involved in gangster culture, but he was also making music about women empowerment. His mother was also a part of the Black Panthers, and he was born in a prison. And how that led and sculpted and shaped his life was such a prime example of the way that Frida Kahlo's experiences shaped her life and artwork, and how their work and their creativity was directly inspired by their life experiences. So I feel like both of those people have so much in common. And they were both people that like really were innovators in terms of the idea of the artist persona, and how they really, you know, it was important about how people saw them, and also how they thought about themselves. I think the confidence and self-love was really important for those two artists. What conversation did I think that they would have? I think that they would have a lot in common. That would definitely be a party that I'd love to be a part of. But I don't know. I feel like there'd be beverages involved. I feel like there'd be some really some interesting political conversations happening there. But I feel like there's so much relationship there between like how they see women's empowerment, and how they both made that a part of their artwork.
I think it'd be a fun conversation. We have a question in the Q&A box. Being a parent and an educator, how did you feel upon seeing the Art Kids booklet that the PMA published featuring your work in the Century Vase?
You know, I saw this image of this kid with his face inside of a pot, and it just brought me to this feeling that I felt like it was full circle. You know, like I used to be a security guard at the Parktown Place Apartments across the street from the PMA, and I was a doorman for about a couple years. And I would walk over to the Philadelphia Museum of Art steps and just people watch. But I didn't go into the museum because I was like, you know, I don't know what there is in there for me. You know, like I didn't have that relationship with art yet. And, you know, that really was a prelude to me thinking a little bit about, you know, why being in this museum context, especially in a booklet for kids, is so important to me. It's because kids get to see themselves reflected in the museum and their collection, and then they get to see themselves as potentially being the artists that are in that space. And this happened for me a couple of times, like seeing a Frida painting in the museum or seeing a Diego painting in the museum gave me that same sense. And so I really love the idea of being able to provide that for other people.
Yeah, and actually, you know, all month in the Art Kids studio, we're we're doing a project that's inspired by your work, and we're introducing kids to clay. So for anyone with kids out there, it's a great month to stop by the Art Kids studio.
I love that.
I'll just keep going. There's so many great questions and comments in the Q&A box. So Pamela Joyce writes, Roberto, your work is amazing. Thank you for your art. It speaks to me as somebody who grew up similar to you. I went into social work to help children and families who are experiencing much of what I lived through as a child, young adult. At the heart of me, I'm an artist, but was not exposed to art as an option for education and career. Art can be a career. How can we get this message to the next generation?
For me, I think it's about having more people like you in positions to be able to think through how that happens, because I feel like so much of it is access and introduction. There's so many institutions that, take art that's been stripped from schools and take it directly to the students and make art access free, or have an option for access to be free. So, that's the reason why I teach in the streets, because of the fact that I think about how many steps somebody would have to take to get involved in a pottery class, and how that's just like, in the grand scheme of things, impossible. I always tell this analogy that, like, the community that I come from, people are worried about having food. They're not worried about the dish that they're eating it out of, right? And so, why would handmade pottery be important in that situation? I think, like, it's, for me, the way that I interact with that is, first, as somebody who represents that culture, but then also thinking about how I can help foster more creative people, more makers, because of the fact that, like, regardless of what community you grew up in, there's people that can be doctors, there are people that can be social workers, but there's also people that can be artists as well. And there's also intersections between all of those things. And so I think it's about introducing the arts in some capacity, especially at a young age. But then I think it's also about access. So there's a lot of really great programs. One of the great artists in the Philadelphia area, his name is Matt Temesco, and he's been teaching people in the community, a lot of, especially people who are recovering, how to make art. And he's been creating murals in collaboration with them and putting them across the city. But that has been, like, giving a lot of people jobs. So not only teaching art, but, like, creating a space where people are getting paid to make art. So that way they're, like, being supported through that process. And that is, like, paid a lot of dividends. And that program is being partially funded by the city and through Mural Arts in Philadelphia.
Excellent. This relates a little bit to a question that Robin Abrams asked, which is, are there people you grew up with in Kensington engaged in your work?
It's interesting because people that I grew up, they're really proud of me, but it's also, they also have different places where their priorities are in life. Like, a lot of them are still struggling. They're figuring out how to exist in spaces where, all the houses are being bought up and they can't afford anything anymore. They're having a hard time finding a job because of the access. So, to see somebody like me is inspiring, but at the same time, it's like, why is art important when I'm going through all of this? And, I hope at some point, some people connect with it, but it doesn't resonate with every single person. And I can't, change their minds in that way. It's not my job to do that. But what I can continue to do is to figure out ways to support the next generation of people to be able to get access and be able to see why these things are important.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll just maybe end on this next question, which comes from Mimi Barton. And she writes, Rob, you know how proud I am of you. And she's wondering, when is your next opening in Philadelphia? Like, when can we all come see your work?
That's a great question. And actually, I'd love to point out that Ms. Barton, I'm going to call her Ms. Barton because she was my high school teacher. And she was the one teacher that really inspired me to write poetry. And she actually made a newsletter that was it wasn't running very often in Mastbaum, where I applied to high school. I actually went to Kensington High School my first year, and I didn't get into any of the high schools I applied to, and it was because the school never sent any of my applications away. And I eventually got into Mass Bomb, where I met Ms. Barton, and she was like a place for me to hide away from everything else and write poetry. And it was so exciting. I remember I wrote a poem when my grandmother passed away, and she allowed me to publish it in the newsletter. And so many of my peers walked up to me and was like, I really love that poem that you wrote, Rob. And that's really the early stages of me being able to write what it is that I do. So I owe so much to her. And that's just a prime example of like how one person can make a huge difference in a system that's really complicated. So as far as a show in Philadelphia, last year I did 4 solo exhibitions.
Wow.
And so I've been really kind of trying to slow down a little bit and think about how I can, be most effective with my artwork, and so I've been working on a project with Mural Arts in Philadelphia. That's going to be a public art project where I'm making 4 public sculptures that are going to go in different parts of Kensington. And through that process, I'm co-writing a children's book. And that's going to be kind of like the way that we document the entire project. And it's called We Here. And through that project, we're teaching people in the community how to make patterns. And then those patterns will eventually go on the artworks that are going to be installed. So even though that's not a traditional gallery sort of white pedestal exhibition, I still see that as an art exhibition, and one that's really kind of like relevant to the sort of community and the what I want to see in the world.
That sounds fantastic. I know I'll be excited to see that and to see the children's book.
Yeah.
Well, we're about at time. Roberto, thank you so much, not just for sharing your practice, but for all your stories and sharing so much. It was really an incredible talk. And I think hearing it makes seeing your work even more meaningful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for showing up. It's like this, my favorite comedian, John Mulaney, says, it's so easy to do nothing. So the fact that you did anything tonight and you came up and you showed up for art is just huge, especially supporting artists like myself and the incredible work that the museum is doing to make sure people like me have a voice. So thank you.
And I'll just, Roberto, echo for you so you know that so many people are writing into the chat and the Q&A. Thank you. They find your work so interesting, so beautiful, so inspiring. I'll echo Roberto's thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I'll also say thanks to everyone behind the scenes who made this all come together. That includes Steve in AV, Julia in public programs, Cristobal and Pau for their translation, and Deb for captioning. So truly it is wonderful that we could come together tonight and have this experience. The program is recorded. We're going to share a link to that recording via email and a follow-up email. And with that, I'll just wish you all a good night. And again, thank you, Roberto.
You're welcome. All right, everybody, have a great night.
Good night.